Picture this. Two cars. Side by side. The biggest drag race in the world. One guy runs faster. The other guy wins. And that right there tells you everything you need to know about drag racing and everything you need to know about the man this video is about. September 1988. Lucas Oil Raceway at Indianapolis. Final round of the US Nationals Funny Car Eliminator. On one side of the track, you've got Kenny Bernstein. Multiple Funny Car Championships, major Winston Cup sponsorship, the hottest operation in the class. On the other side, you've got Ed McCulloch in the Larry Minor Miller Racing Oldsmobile. Nobody in that grandstand is betting against Bernstein. Not one person. The tree cycles down. Both cars launch. And here is what printed on the time slip when it was over. Bernstein ran a 5.347 at 270.83 miles per hour. McCulloch ran a 5.355 at 271.16 miles per hour. If you're sitting there thinking, wait, McCulloch was slower and still won, you're reading it exactly right. He left the starting line first. He crossed the finish line first. Hole shot win. At Indianapolis, in one of the quickest side-by-side funny car runs NHRA had ever recorded to that point. McCulloch's fourth US Nationals funny car victory, and Bernstein was, by his own account, absolutely furious. McCulloch reportedly told him he'd give him reading for Indy any day of the week. And then 2 years later, he went back and won his fifth. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the history of drag racing and the careers that should be talked about in every conversation but somehow aren't. If you're someone who loves the deep cuts of motorsport history, the guys who built the sport before the cameras and the corporate money arrived, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now here's what most people don't realize about Ed McCulloch. He won 6 US Nationals titles. At the time he retired from driving, that was more than Don Prudhomme had won there, and more than John Force had won there. He accumulated 22 NHRA national event victories as a driver and then went on to win 27 more as a crew chief. He broke 3 consecutive elapsed time barriers in funny car, the 5.40, the 5.30, and the 5.20 first. He's in 2 separate halls of fame. And he never, not once, won an NHRA season championship. That's the thread running through everything in this video, and by the time we're done, you're going to understand exactly how that happened and why it matters. Let's go back to the beginning. And the beginning is Oregon in the early 1960s, which is not where you'd expect one of drag racing's all-time greats to emerge from. But here's the thing, drag racing was taking root everywhere in that era. The Pacific Northwest had its own ecosystem of guys building cars, running local strips, and grinding through the kind of repetitions that eventually produce elite-level skill. McCulloch came up in that world. The historical record gets a little murky on some of the biographical details. Sources differ on whether he was born in California and raised in Oregon, or just an Oregon guy start to finish. His exact birth year isn't published anywhere I could find with certainty, though the math from various interviews places him around 1942. What we know for certain is that by 1964, he and his brother Dan built a Chevrolet-powered top-fuel dragster and took it to Woodburn Dragstrip in Oregon. And on the second pass, he didn't lift off the throttle in time, clipped the centerline concrete timing blocks, and flipped the car. The machine was destroyed. He swore he'd never drive again. That lasted about as long as you'd expect from a guy with racing in his blood. He partnered with Jim Albrich to build a new car, went with a Chrysler-powered Kent Fuller chassis machine they called Northwind, hired a driver named Dave Jeffers, and then promptly couldn't afford to pay him. So McCulloch ended up back behind the wheel, which, look, was probably how it was always going to go. He also teamed up at various points with fellow Oregonian Ernie Hall during this period. And this is where the nickname comes from. June 13, 1965. Woodburn Dragstrip. McCulloch defeats Jerry Ruth in a match race. Jerry Ruth's nickname was King. So the logic writes itself. An ace beats a king. From that moment forward, he is the ace. That name goes on the car, it goes on the livery, and it follows him for the rest of his career. He earned the #1 spot on Drag News' Mr. Eliminator list shortly after that win and held it for most of 1965 and into 1966. In the Pacific Northwest Nitro top fuel scene, he was the guy everyone was chasing. Then 1969 arrives and everything changes. A man named Art Whipple shows up with a big block Chevrolet funny car Camaro. Whipple wants to race it himself but asks McCulloch to make some test passes first. McCulloch qualifies the thing #1 at Woodburn and wins the event on debut, in a car he had never once driven before. And his reaction to this experience? He falls completely in love with the funny car category. He never went back to dragsters. Not once. Now you might be thinking, why does that matter? Here's the thing. You've got to understand what the funny car category was in 1969. It was still brand new. NHRA had only just run its first funny car eliminator at the 1969 Winter Nationals. These cars were chaotic and dangerous and utterly spectacular, and the crowds absolutely lost their minds over them. Where a dragster was precision engineering in its purest form, a funny car was this insane fire-breathing monster wearing the costume of something you'd see sitting on a dealership lot. The contrast was intoxicating, and McCulloch recognized immediately that this was where the future of nitro racing was heading. Whipple and McCulloch sold the Camaro and McCulloch's dragster and pooled the money to build their first real funny car together. A 1970 Plymouth Duster, supercharged 426 Hemi on nitromethane, the combination everyone was running. But this car had features nobody else was running. Full side windows, a roof hatch escape system. Both essentially unheard of on funny cars at a time when getting out of a burning car was more improvisation than planning. They ran it at Orange County International Raceway and set national records of 7.10 seconds at 211 miles per hour. Genuinely fast for 1970. Then, on the way to the US Nationals, an electrical short started a fire in the trailer. By the time McCulloch got the car unstrapped and out the door, fire was coming 10 feet out of it. Car, trailer, every piece of equipment they owned gone. On the side of the highway to Indianapolis, they rebuilt. Woody Gilmore chassis Plymouth Barracuda. Got it to the World Finals in Dallas where McCulloch reached the final round and lost to Gene Snow when the transmission gave out. But he won the Division 6 championship and the program was still breathing. That resilience, that ability to absorb a catastrophic loss and just keep building, is going to become a defining theme in this story. Remember that. So, 1971. This is the year everything clicks for the first time. McCulloch shows up at Indianapolis with Ed Wills now helping with the program. He qualifies second behind Henry Harrison, and then he runs through the field like a man who has been waiting his entire life for this specific moment. He beats Sammy Miller. He beats Jim Dunn. He beats Connie Kalitta. And in the final round, he draws Dale Poulda, who is driving Mickey Thompson's Radical Titanium Body Pinto. That car weighed around 1,700 pounds, which was about as light as anyone had gotten a funny car at that point in history. Thompson was always pushing the envelope on construction, and Poulda's car catches fire during the run, which ended that particular experiment in dramatic fashion. McCulloch wins. First US Nationals victory. First NHRA national event win of his career. He talked about it later and said winning that race made him feel like he was set for life. And you understand that completely when you realize what the Indianapolis race meant in that era. It wasn't just a race. It was the race. Winning Indy meant you were legitimate. It meant the sport recognized you. It meant everything. Late in 1971, McCulloch lands sponsorship from Revell, the model kit company. And I know what you're thinking. A model kit company? That sounds like a strange arrangement for a professional racing program. But here's what most people don't realize about that deal. Revel's entire business model depended on selling plastic model kits of race cars to kids who were absolutely obsessed with this stuff. Having your name on a Revel kit meant your livery was sitting in hobby shops across the country. It meant millions of households were looking at your paint scheme every time some kid opened the box on Christmas morning. The brand exposure was genuinely significant. They also brought Castrol oil money into the partnership. The car debuted at the NHRA Super Nationals at Ontario, California, as the Revel-sponsored Dodge Demon. Someone at Revel named the car the Revolution. The lettering featured 14 RS across the hood and side. And Kenny Youngblood painted a scheme that became one of the most recognizable liveries in drag racing history. When people talk about the iconic cars of that era, the Revolution belongs in that conversation without any argument. Now we get to 1972. And I want to spend real time here because what McCulloch did in 1972 is legitimately one of the great individual seasons in the history of the sport, and almost nobody outside the hardcore community ever talks about it. This is where it gets really interesting. He starts at the Winter Nationals at Pomona. Wins it. That's actually the last race with Art Whipple as his partner, because Whipple departs after Pomona to work with Ed Wills. And the conventional wisdom at the time was that losing Whipple would hurt McCulloch significantly. Whipple had been the organizational backbone of the operation. Without him, it was going to be McCulloch and his brother Dan against everyone else in the class. The prediction was that the program would struggle. What actually happened was McCulloch went to Gainesville for the Gator Nationals and won it. Then Columbus for the Spring Nationals and won that too. 3 consecutive national event wins to open the season with a 2-man operation running against teams that had significantly more resources. He also won the prestigious March meet at Bakersfield driving Jim Murphy's car, the former McCulloch Barracuda, now rebranded as Holy Smoke. And then he came back to Indianapolis in September and won his 2nd consecutive US Nationals funny car title. His round record at national events across that entire season was 24 wins and 3 losses. In an era where you might have only 7 or 8 national events on the entire calendar, a 24-3 record is not a statistic, it is a statement. That number is genuinely absurd when you sit with it. So obviously he won the championship that year, right? He absolutely did not. And here's the thing about how NHRA crowned funny car champions in the early 1970s that most casual fans don't know. It wasn't based on season-long performance. They ran the entire championship at the World Finals. Win the World Finals, you're champion for the year. That was the entire system. And at the 1972 World Finals, McCulloch lost in the quarterfinals to Butch Moss. Larry Fullerton won the World Finals and took the championship. McCulloch's 24-3 record across the regular season counted for precisely nothing in the championship standings. 0 points. 0 recognition. Like it never happened. Now look, I'm going to say something direct here. That system was genuinely unfair. Not kind of unfair. Not arguably unfair. Structurally, administratively, fundamentally unfair to any driver who built sustained excellence across a full season. When NHRA eventually switched to a cumulative points format, it was clearly more equitable. But the switchover happened after McCulloch's most dominant seasons had already been written out of the championship record with no path to correction. He deserved at minimum a serious argument for the 1972 championship. He never got to make that argument. The rules simply didn't allow it. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's rough, but it's just 1 year. Here's the thing. This pattern is going to repeat itself in ways that become increasingly hard to explain away as bad luck. The 1972 situation was a rules problem. What comes later is something different and honestly something worse, because it's going to be so much closer. 1973 continued the momentum. McCulloch is doing north of 100 race meets per year at this point. National events, match races, club races every weekend and most weekdays. He and his crew are putting themselves through a grind that is essentially unsustainable by any modern standard of athlete welfare. But in the moment it's working because match racing was how you actually made real money in this era. There might be 7 NHRA national events in a season. There were hundreds of local tracks booking match races, paying appearance fees and percentages of the gate. Jungle Jim Lieberman and TV Tommy Evo were running the same kind of schedule. These guys were on the road constantly, building the sport in regions that never saw a national event, putting Nitro funny cars in front of fans who would otherwise never know what one looked like or sounded like or smelled like. That labor built the audience that drag racing eventually monetized. It's worth remembering who did that work. At Indianapolis in 1973, McCulloch reaches the final round and draws Don Prudhomme. And this loss bothered him more than almost anything else in his entire career. He said years later it would probably bother him forever. What happened was McCulloch's car wheelied coming off the line, and he had to pedal it to keep it from going over backward, which killed his elapsed time. Prudhomme went through at 6.38 to McCulloch's 6.44. Not embarrassing numbers by any stretch. But he was in the other lane, and the difference came down to his car wheeling at the worst possible moment on the biggest possible stage. He couldn't fix it in the seconds he had. He won Car and Driver of the Year that year. Between 1971 and 1973, he had won 5 national event finals out of 7 that he entered. By any honest measurement, he was the most dominant funny car driver in the country across that 3-year window. And still, no championship. The mid-70s got harder. And this is the part of the story that doesn't get told enough, because it's easier to talk about the wins than it is to talk about what happens when the wins stop coming and the road keeps going and the bills keep arriving and the competition keeps getting faster. McCulloch was still out there, still running, still competitive, but the revolution was no longer as far ahead of the field as it had been in 1972. The match racing pace was exhausting in a way that accumulates across years, not days, and the results were reflecting it. 1976 was a particularly brutal year in terms of outcomes. McCulloch reached 3 final rounds that season: the Winter Nationals, the Fall Nationals, and the World Finals. He lost all 3. And here is the detail that makes it sting. It was the same driver every single time. Don Prudhomme. 3 final rounds, 3 losses, all to one guy who happened to be on one of the most dominant championship runs the sport had seen. McCulloch finished 3rd in points that year. It wasn't a lack of effort. It wasn't a lack of speed. Prudhomme was simply on an absolutely different level that season, and happened to be in the other lane every single time McCulloch fought his way to a final. That's drag racing sometimes. You can do almost everything right and still end up with nothing to show for it in the standings. Then in 1977, Revell called and delivered the news that they were ending the sponsorship. The company was moving away from automotive models as a core focus, and the arrangement that had defined McCulloch's public identity for 6 years was finished. And shortly after that, the revolution itself was destroyed in a fire at Fremont Raceway. The car, the livery, the identity, the 14 RS, Kenny Youngblood's paint scheme, all of it gone. When I say gone, I mean physically gone. Not damaged. Not reparable. Gone. Here's what most people don't realize about what Revell's exit actually meant for the program beyond just the obvious financial hit. Sponsorship money in the funny car class in that era was not the kind of corporate infrastructure it would eventually become in the modern period. Having Revell was real cash, plus product, plus model kit exposure that put McCulloch's livery in hobby shops all over the country for years. Losing that required completely rebuilding the financial foundation of the operation while still trying to compete at a national level against teams that hadn't just lost everything. That is genuinely hard to do. Most programs don't survive it. The next couple of years were a hustle in the most honest sense of that word. He ran a Plymouth Arrow with American Shield home warranty backing in 1978, finished ninth in Winston points, made the final round at the Summer Nationals, then sold the Aero to a painter named Bill Carter. And in 1979, he sold his entire racing operation. The combination of the years of constant travel, the sponsorship loss, the car fire, and a victory drought that would have broken most people had ground him down to a point where he made the decision to step away. He was out of drag racing. Done. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Then Ed Pink called. Ed Pink is one of drag racing's genuinely great engine builders, a man whose name carries real weight in the history of the sport. Late in 1979, Pink had a car that needed a driver. The Super Shop's Plymouth Arrow. It had been running with Dave Hoff and Pat Foster behind the wheel, and Pink wanted McCulloch. The deal came together for the 1980 season. Kenny Youngblood, who had painted the Revolution years earlier, painted this car in a dark metallic brown with gold leaf lettering. And it looked unlike anything else in the field, which was entirely the point. These weren't just race cars, they were rolling statements. And at the 1980 US Nationals, here is exactly what happened. Rain pushed the final round to Tuesday morning. McCulloch against Tom McEwen. McEwen ran a 6.24. McCulloch ran a 6.27. McCulloch's car was slower on the time slip. He won anyway, because he left the starting line first. A whole shot at Indianapolis, again, for the third time in his career. Third US Nationals funny car win for a guy who, 1 year earlier, didn't even have a ride. Let that sink in for a moment. No car, no sponsor, no program. And then 1 year later, standing in the winner's circle at the biggest drag race in the world. Super Shops ended the program after that season. And then came the hardest stretch of Ed McCulloch's professional life. 1981 through 1983. The reinforced steel business he'd been running on the side failed when construction activity slumped. He drove Jerry Verhul's second car at some Northwest match races, but it wasn't a real program by any definition. He drove trucks for Art Whipple to make ends meet. His wife Linda held the financial situation together during this period, and McCulloch was explicit about this in later interviews. He didn't soften it or dress it up. Things were bad. The man who had won 3 US Nationals, who had gone 24-3 in a single season, who had been one of the most dominant funny car drivers in the country for the better part of a decade, was driving a truck to keep the lights on. Now, I want to be careful here about how this part of the story gets framed, because it's easy to look at this stretch and read it as a failure. And that's the wrong read entirely. The match racing economy of the 1970s that had sustained McCulloch's program was shrinking. Fuel costs, insurance, track closures, the shift in how racing was being financed, all of those things were happening simultaneously across the sport. McCulloch wasn't the only career that got squeezed in this period. He was just one of the guys who had further to fall because he'd been higher up than most. But here's the thing about Ed McCulloch that the time slips and the win totals don't fully capture on their own. Nothing in his public statements from this period, and nothing in the accounts from people who were around him during these years, suggests he ever became bitter. He was waiting. He knew that if the right situation arrived, he could still do the job at the highest level. That belief, maintained across 3 years of genuine hardship, matters enormously to what happens next. Because what happens next only works if you're still mentally ready when the phone rings. In 1984, Larry Minor called. Larry Minor is a California farming operation guy with serious money and a serious passion for drag racing. He'd been running Gary Beck's Top Fuel dragster under Miller Lite sponsorship with enormous success. Beck was one of the most dominant Top Fuel drivers of the early 1980s, and the Minor operation was a real, well-funded professional program. Now Minor wanted to expand into funny car, and he wanted McCulloch to drive it. The salary offer was not impressive. McCulloch said later he was genuinely stunned at how little Minor was offering for the job. But Linda McCulloch told him this might be his last real shot at a competitive ride, and that he should take it regardless of the number. He also negotiated a deal where he received a percentage of Gary Beck's top fuel winnings, which made the overall financial picture considerably more workable. And crucially, Minor gave him the freedom to run NHRA events and match races on top of the NHRA schedule, which meant real income opportunities beyond just the base salary. The Larry Minor team in those early years was operating on essentially 5 full-time people: McCulloch, Beck, Willie Walter, Bernie Federle, and Darren Cap. 5 people running both a funny car and a top fuel dragster at the top level of professional drag racing simultaneously. The efficiency required to do that at a competitive level would be remarkable by today's standards, where a single Nitro team might have 15 or 20 people just on the car at a national event. 5 people, 2 Nitro cars, top-level competition. That's the operation McCulloch walked into in 1984. And the debut was not smooth. At the Cajun Nationals, McCulloch's Oldsmobile Forenza got loose, crossed the center line, and hit John Collins's JVC Camaro at speed. Both cars were destroyed in one of the more spectacular 2-car crashes NHRA had recorded in that era. Both drivers walked away without serious injury, which in a Nitro funny car crash at those speeds is genuinely fortunate. Larry Minor bought Collins a replacement car after the incident. No argument, no negotiation, no drawn-out process. He bought the man a car. That tells you something important about how Minor operated and about the culture of the team McCulloch had joined. There were no wins for the year. The program was still finding its footing, still learning how the pieces fit together, still figuring out what the car needed. But the foundation was being laid. The equipment was Miller Lite-sponsored Oldsmobiles, and that Oldsmobile connection was real in a way that manufacturer relationships with drag teams often weren't in that era. Oldsmobile provided body shell support to Minor's team across many years of the program. That kind of factory involvement, even indirect factory involvement, gave the operation a stability that pure independent programs didn't have. When you can call the manufacturer and get body support, you're not scrambling the way everyone else is scrambling. Then in 1986, something shifted inside the operation that changed everything. Bernie Federle, who had been primarily working Gary Beck's top fuel dragster, moved over to concentrate on McCulloch's funny car full-time. And here is what makes that significant. Federle was a dragster guy by background and by inclination. He had spent his career thinking about top fuel dragsters, tuning top fuel dragsters, understanding top fuel dragsters. He had never tuned a funny car extensively before making this move. The conventional expectation would be a learning curve, an adjustment period, some growing pains while Federle figured out the differences between the two applications. McCulloch later said Federle was great with it immediately. No extended adjustment period. No visible learning curve from the outside. The two of them divided the labor in a logical way that played to both of their strengths. Federle handled the engine tuning. McCulloch handled the clutch. And then they started talking to each other, really talking, the way two people who trust each other's judgment can talk about a technical problem. They figured each other out quickly. And then the results started coming. They won at Gainesville in 1986. Took Atlanta too. And across the following seasons, the McCulloch-Federle combination did something that had never been done before in funny car racing. They broke the 5.40 elapsed time barrier. Then the 5.30 barrier. Then the 5.20 barrier. 3 sequential milestones in funny car performance, and it was this program, this 5-person operation with the Oldsmobile body shells and the Miller sponsorship, that got there first each time. Not the bigger teams. Not the better-funded operations. This one. Here's the thing about those numbers that you need to sit with for a moment. When McCulloch first climbed into a funny car in 1969, the cars were running in the mid-7-second range. By 1988, he and Federle had a car running in the low 5s. That is not incremental improvement. That is a complete reinvention of what the category was capable of, compressed into roughly 2 decades of development. The performance revolution that happened in drag racing across that period was genuinely staggering, and McCulloch was not a passive observer of it. He was one of the people making it happen. 1987, McCulloch wins in Dallas with a national record run. Finishes third in Winston Point. The program is fully rebuilt at this point. He's back in every conversation that matters. And then comes 1988, which is where we started this video and which deserves more detail than just the Indy final against Bernstein. He won in Atlanta that year. He took the NHRA Funny Car National Championship and a $100,000 bonus check at Billy Meyer's event. He won Car and Driver of the Year for the second time in his career, separated by 15 years from the first. The financial arrangement with Minor and the freedom to run outside events meant this was the most money Ed McCulloch had ever made from racing. The program that started with a salary offer that stunned him had turned into the most successful stretch of his professional life. Worth pausing here on something that gets overlooked in the 1988 conversation. John Force had been on the circuit for years at this point. He'd been grinding away, running competitive equipment, building toward something. Force collected his first career NHRA national event win in Montreal in 1987, and the driver he beat in that final round was Ed McCulloch, whose blower snout broke during the run. Force would eventually become the defining figure of funny car racing for the next 2 decades, would win 16 championships, would become arguably the most recognizable name in the history of the class. In 1988, he was still figuring out how to win consistently. McCulloch was the one people were talking about. That context matters when you're trying to understand where McCulloch stood in the sport at that specific moment. Then 1989 and 1990 arrive. And this is where the championship story becomes genuinely painful to think about if you care at all about competitive fairness. The Miller sponsorship had cycled through Miller Lite to Miller American to Miller High Life across the years. The car was still competitive. McCulloch and Federley were still running at the front of the field. And 1990 starts producing results at a pace that matches anything McCulloch had done in 1972. He wins 5 times in 9 final round appearances across the season. 5 wins. 9 finals. Those are numbers that in any other year in any other competitive landscape would be a championship season without much debate. And he comes back to Indianapolis for the 5th time as a funny car final round contender. And he wins. His 5th US Nationals funny car title, which at that moment in September 1990 is more than any other driver in the history of the class had won at that specific race. More than Prudhomme. More than Force. More than anyone. The painter John Pugh had hidden 5 playing card aces inside the paint scheme of the competition number on the car. McCulloch didn't know they were there. He found out in the winner's circle at Indianapolis when the sunlight hit the paint at the right angle and you could see the cards worked into the design. That story is almost too perfect to be true. But it is true. And I love that detail more than almost anything else in this entire story. He finished second in Winston points that year behind John Force, who won his first championship. McCulloch lost the title by 43 points. 43. In a full season of NHRA funny car racing, 43 points represents 1, maybe 2 round losses in qualifying or eliminations across an entire year. The margin between winning the championship of his life and finishing second was essentially nothing. It was a rounding error in a long season. It was the difference between a good day and a bad day at one race somewhere in the middle of the calendar that nobody remembers now. And John Force, who won that championship by 43 points, went on to win 16 more after it. McCulloch's 1990 season would have been the first of precisely 0. That's the number. 0 championship. Across a career that spans from 1964 to 1993 as a driver, and then continues as a crew chief well into the 2000s. 0. Now look. I want to address something directly here because you might be thinking, well, lots of great drivers never won championships. That's true. It happens. But here's what makes McCulloch's situation different from the standard narrative of a talented driver who just couldn't quite get there. In 1972, the rules structurally prevented his dominant season from producing a championship. That wasn't a competitive failure. That was an administrative one. The system was designed in a way that made sustained excellence across a full season essentially irrelevant to the championship outcome. And in 1990, he lost by 43 points to a driver who then became one of the most dominant champions in the history of any motorsport category. Those are two completely different kinds of missing a championship, and neither of them reflects a deficiency in Ed McCulloch as a racing driver. 1991, Miller ends its sponsorship of the program. They find backing from Otter Pops, which is one of those sponsorship stories that sounds like someone made it up but is completely real. Otter Pops, the frozen ice pop brand, on a Nitro funny car at national event. McCulloch makes 4 final rounds and finishes 4th in point. It's still a competitive program by any reasonable measure. But the big money is gone, the runway is clearly shortening, and everyone involved knows it. The era is ending. And then at 50 years old, Ed McCulloch makes a move that surprises basically everyone in the sport. He switches to Top Fuel. Larry Minor had a McDonald's-sponsored Top Fuel dragster tuned by Lee Beard, and McCulloch climbs into it for the 1992 season. Think about what that means for a moment. 50 years old. Switching from a funny car, a vehicle with a body over it that provides some sense of enclosure, to a Top Fuel dragster, which is essentially an exposed seat on a chassis that accelerates from 0 to 300 miles per hour in less than 4.5 seconds. At 50, after nearly 30 years of racing at the top level, and in 1992, he wins the US Nationals in Top Fuel, his 6th Indianapolis victory overall, which places him in a group of exactly 4 drivers in the history of the sport who have won the US Nationals in both Nitro classes. Don Prudhomme, Kenny Bernstein, Ed McCulloch, and later Jim Head. That's the complete list. 4 names. McCulloch is one of them. He also takes 3 wins total in 5 final rounds across the 1992 season and finishes 5th in point. At 50 years old, in a category he had never competed in at the national level before that season. 1993, he runs 301.70 miles per hour in Dallas and becomes the 12th member of the 300 miles per hour club in Top Fuel, an exclusive group of drivers who had crossed that barrier at the time. He wins his 22nd and final NHRA national event at the Houston Nationals. He is 51 years old, running a Top Fuel dragster at 300 miles per hour, finishing 8th in point. After a brief stint in a Top Fueler owned by former baseball player Jack Clark called the Taco Bell Express, he steps away from driving entirely. The career behind the wheel is over. So let's talk about what those final numbers actually look like when you lay them all out. 22 NHRA national event wins as a driver, 18 in funny car, 4 in Top Fuel, 6 US Nationals victories, 5 of them in funny car, a record that at the time exceeded both Prudhomme and Force. 7 consecutive years in the top 5 of Winston funny car points from 1985 through 1991. A 109-race consecutive qualifying streak, which represents an extraordinary level of consistency across a sport where mechanical failure alone can end your day at any moment. The Car and Driver of the Year award, twice, 15 years apart. Division 6 Championship, IHRA National Championship, first to break 3 consecutive elapsed time barriers in funny car alongside Federley. 2 Hall of Fame inductions, and no season championship anywhere on the list. That absence sits in the middle of all those achievements like a gap in a sentence that should have a word in it. But here's what most people don't realize about Ed McCulloch, and this is the part of the story that I think genuinely separates him from almost every other driver of his generation. The man who did all of that behind the wheel then went and built an entirely separate, distinguished career as a crew chief at the same level of the sport. He didn't walk away and go play golf. He didn't go do corporate appearances and sign autographs at nostalgia events. He went back to work. He tuned for Connie Kalitta and got 2 final round appearances out of that program. Then he moved to Doug Kalitta and won twice in 7 finals across 1998 and 1999. Real wins. National event wins. Not ceremonial involvement. Then at the end of 1999, he took over the funny car operation for Ron Capps at Don Prudhomme Racing. Don Prudhomme. The same Don Prudhomme whose US Nationals record McCulloch had broken. The same Don Prudhomme who had beaten him in the 1973 Indy Final in a loss that McCulloch said would bother him forever. Now McCulloch was tuning a car for Prudhomme's team. That's a detail that the sport should talk about more than it does. He tuned Capps to multiple wins and a second-place points finish in 2000. This is where it gets really interesting. In 2005, he reunited with Capps, now at Don Schumacher Racing, and what followed was one of the most productive crew chief and driver partnerships in the modern funny car era. 16 victories together. 16. McCulloch's career crew chief win total eventually reached 27, which means he won more races as a crew chief than most drivers win in their entire careers behind the wheel. And worth noting specifically, he embraced computer-based data acquisition and tuning tools in a way that not every veteran driver turned crew chief was willing to do. The sport was changing technically at a rapid pace through the 2000s, and McCulloch changed with it. That adaptability across a career spanning 5 decades is something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about what made him exceptional. In mid-2010, Don Schumacher replaced McCulloch with John Medlin as Capps crew chief. McCulloch announced his full retirement. He said he would not be returning to Schumacher Racing. He had no other deals lined up. He was done. And he was emotional about leaving Capps specifically, in a way that went beyond professional disappointment. He said Capps was like a son to him. That kind of relationship, built across years of shared pressure and shared success inside a Nitro pit, doesn't get replaced by another job offer. When it ends, it just ends. He also mentioned in retirement that current Top Fuel and funny car drivers were still calling him for advice. Think about what that means practically. You are an active NHRA competitor. You have access to your own crew chief, your team's engineering staff, your manufacturer's technical support. And you are still picking up the phone and calling a retired 70-something crew chief because the knowledge that accumulated across 45 years of doing this at the absolute highest level is not something you can replicate from a textbook or a data system. That's what genuine expertise looks like from the outside. People who don't need to call you, calling you anyway. One more thing that I think is genuinely great and that most people who know McCulloch's racing career have never heard. After he retired from driving, he competed in the Fast Masters Championship exhibition at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. This was an event that paired drag racing legends and oval track legends and road course legends in production sports cars against each other. McCulloch got behind the wheel of a Jaguar XJ220 and raced against people like Bobby Allison, Gary Bettenhausen, and Dick Trickle. Drivers who had spent their entire careers running on ovals and road courses, who understood cornering and braking and track position in ways that drag racers simply don't develop from a quarter mile at a time. McCulloch, who had never once competed on anything other than a straight drag strip in his entire professional life, won 2 heat races. The guy was just a natural talent inside a vehicle, regardless of what the vehicle was or what it required of him. That detail tells you something about the quality of the athlete that the drag racing context sometimes obscures. So what is the legacy then? What do you actually say about Ed McCulloch when you're trying to put the whole thing in one place? NHRA ranked him 19th on their 50 greatest drivers list in 2001. He's in the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame, inducted in 2000. He's in the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America, inducted in 2011. Those are not honorary participation awards handed out to popular figures. Those are institutions with standards, run by people who argue seriously about who belongs and who doesn't, recognizing that his career stands up against any driver in the history of the sport when you look at it honestly. The Revolution is probably the car most people remember if they're old enough to remember any of it. The dark metallic brown Super Shops Aero made a strong visual impression on everyone who saw it. The Miller High Life Oldsmobile with the hidden aces worked into the paint is one of those details that sticks permanently once you hear it. Revell produced multiple model kit versions of his cars across the years, which meant the Revolution especially lived in hobby shops and on kids' desks and in garages all over the country long after the actual car was gone. There's a photograph of McCulloch punching a rival named Flash Gordon Mineo at a Seattle event that has apparently circulated widely enough to have been turned into unauthorized t-shirts, which is its own kind of cultural recognition. The crash with John Collins in 1984 is on video and it has been watched a lot. These moments add up to a genuine cultural presence in the sport that goes beyond the statistic. Here's the thing about the championship absence that I keep coming back to. It won't sit still in the historical record, no matter how many times you try to set it aside and just focus on everything else. In 1972, the rules simply didn't allow a season like his to produce a championship. That wasn't a competitive failure on his part. That was an administrative failure by the sanctioning body, and it cannot be corrected retroactively. In 1990, he was 43 points away from beating John Force in the season that turned out to be the first of Force's 17 championship. The difference between being a former champion and being a guy who never quite got there was 43 points in one season against one of the most dominant championship performers in the history of motorsport. Not just drag racing, motorsport broadly. And in the match race era of the 1970s, he was one of 3 or 4 drivers most responsible for keeping the sport alive in regions that never saw a national event. That labor is almost entirely invisible in the historical record because it doesn't show up in points standings or win totals. It shows up in the survival of local tracks and the growth of regional fan bases and the continued viability of a sport that was still figuring out what it was going to be. McCulloch did that work for years at a pace that would have broken most people, and the championship system of the era gave him nothing for it. Combine the 22 wins as a driver with the 27 wins as a crew chief and attach them to one name in one unified career record, and the conversation about where Ed McCulloch ranks in the history of drag racing looks completely different than the one people are currently having. The Revolution with its 14 RS is still out there in photographs and on model kit boxes and in the memories of people who were at those tracks in 1972. And the 1988 Indy time slip showing 5.355 at 271.16 on one side and 5.347 at 270.83 on the other is sitting somewhere in an archive reminding anyone who looks at it that winning isn't always about who goes fastest. Sometimes it's about who gets there first. Ed McCulloch understood that better than almost anyone who ever ran a Nitro car. And the sport is still catching up to what he actually was.